Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us at this North West Regional Schools meeting. My name's Pam Howard. I'm one of the North West Regional Reps and Chair of the National Schools Committee, and I'm going to be chairing this meeting today. And also with us, we've got John Richards, Assistant General Secretary, who's going to speak to us regarding current COVID issues and catch up within schools. Chris Faby, National Officer, who's going to do a presentation on ventilation within schools, and Keith Bradley, Regional Lead for Schools, who's going to assist with the question and answer sessions. Just to make you aware that the meeting will be recorded, so please bear that in mind if you intend to join in to ask a question, because your face and your name will be shown and it will appear possibly on Facebook after the meeting when we put out the recording. You can also put questions in the chat facility if you would like to, and you can either give your name and I'll call you in to actually ask your question, or you can remain anonymous and we'll deal with your question as we go through the questions later on in the session. So just a little bit of a brief introduction from myself. As you'll be aware, schools returned in September to business as normal, and this meant no longer operating in year group bubbles or wearing face coverings in the secondary sector. So pupils no longer have to isolate if they've been a close contact of someone who's tested positive with COVID. School staff no longer have to isolate either if they've been in close contact with someone who's tested positive, even if they've had both vaccinations, that is. So the government data shows that confirmed COVID cases among school-aged children surged by 102,000 on the 30th of September. That was a 67% rise since the 16th of September, which meant that over 2,400 pupils were absent from school that week for COVID-related reasons. And to put this into context, it translates to a 1 in 14 infection rate among secondary age pupils, with unprecedented numbers in the primary sector also. In order to curb these infection rates, it's imperative that measures are reintroduced in our schools, including face coverings in the secondary sector. The reintroduction of bubbles and social distancing measures should be put back in place also, with assemblies returning to virtual platforms. Only today it was being announced that Trafford Council is to request that staff and pupils return to wearing face coverings due to the increased infection rates across the borough. So increased ventilation remains crucial. However, just 2% of the promised carbon dioxide monitors have been delivered to schools so far, more than a month after the government's 25 million ventilation scheme started. When schools returned in September, only 41 schools across the country had received monitors in the first week of the scheme. Increased staff absences further impacting on children's education, placing other staff and school leaders under enormous strain. So now I would like to hand over to John Richards, who's here to speak to us regarding COVID issues and education catch-up. Thank you, John. It's over to you.
Thanks, Pam, and thanks to colleagues from the North West for inviting me to speak at this. I'm going to say just a few words introduction and then hand over to Chris to talk about ventilation a while, and obviously happy to try and answer any questions we can. And as Pam said, I'm Assistant General Secretary. Not too long ago, I was head of local government education and been involved in school work for a long time, so I know the area quite well. But I think what's really interesting, as I was reflecting, obviously, before I did this speech tonight, is here we are, 1 year on, and has the government learned anything about COVID whatsoever? Are we almost in exactly the similar position we were in last year? And a new Secretary of State appears to be repeating the same mistakes that the last one did. It's beyond belief that we told the government, how many times in this past year have we told the government they shouldn't get rid of the safety measures all at once, and if they did, there'd be a spike of numbers. But again and again they ploughed ahead, and again we've seen people having to step back and introduce measures as a result. So where are we now? I mean, Pam's just talked about some of the stats. school ages cases amongst school children surged to over 100,000, 67% increase, and 1 in 14 pupils in secondary schools are off and levels unprecedented in primaries. But also staff absence is high, and that's a real problem for us because it's impacting on schools' ability to actually educate pupils and putting other staff and leaders under enormous strain. There is some evidence that school numbers are flattening. We saw some potential last week, and we know that that's what the government's model will have a real better idea this week and the following week as a result of the flow through to see whether the vaccinations worked and whether actually the systems worked through. But we still don't understand why the government isn't trying to stop this, why it's letting the virus rip through the schools at this time, when we know that simple control measures, those that we had in place before, would clearly slow down or interfere and stop people getting sick. It just makes sense. So obviously last week, you may have seen that myself and 4 of the unions wrote to the new Secretary of State at the department and said, why don't you just come back on board, put back some of these mitigations, put back some of these safety measures. This is the sensible thing to do to try and slow down the spread of the virus. And, we've now seen that some local councils are bringing back these measures. And once more, it's local leaders who are making hard decisions. New ministerial team left lagging behind. And it just seems utterly bizarre that at this stage, we're in this place again. And talking of vaccines, I think some of you may well have seen, I don't know if you've seen this, the cease and desist letters that are being sent to schools, warning to whom it may concern. We believe that you are involved in either decision-making or practical elements in the rolling out of experimental Pfizer gene therapies to children between the ages of 12 to 15. I was sent this handwritten envelope from Portsmouth. No explanation, just 2 leaflets trying to intimidate me. And, there's no way I'm giving into, anonymous threats. In fact, if anything, it makes me want to react the other way. So let me make it clear. Unison is a responsible union. We want the best education, the best health for students and staff. Therefore, we're in favour of vaccination. That's what the vast majority of scientists think is important that we should do. And it's a way of reducing illness, helping staff and pupils get back to the job. And the job I know that, large numbers of you on this call love and want to get back into doing. Having said that, we also think that governments need to be very careful about trying to force vaccination on staff, because it's not the way to persuade people who are resistant, those who are nervous, or those who are so busy they haven't got around to having the jab, although you would think by now that most people should have done so. And we also think it's outrageous that gangs of anti-vaxxers should wander around harassing school staff. Not long ago, Piers Corbyn, a famous relative, and a mob invaded the NEU's head office down in London, just round the corner from Unison Centre. And we were put on alert to expect that we could be invaded too. We're clear that any attempt by anti-vaxxers to disrupt school life should mean schools get straight onto the police to stop any nonsense. So this term, we've continued to meet with the Department for Education and press them to make changes. The new Secretary of State dropped into one of the regular meetings we have with senior civil servants, and we forced ourselves into a special education needs working party, where the Department for Education was originally only going to include teaching units. And what we've also tried to do is find out how people are feeling on this. A recent survey is giving us an idea of what's happening in schools, and it's noticeable that schools have not just relaxed the government measures around bubbles and face coverings, but it's led to a general relaxation in some of the areas. So risk assessments are not being pursued as rigorously as they were. They're not being as updated they were. And things like staggered start, lunch times are less in evidence, although testing does appear to have held up for the start of term. We also questioned people about the involvement of our members in catch-up, and Pam said I'd say a few words about catch-up and recovery, and what we can see is the vital role that support staff are playing. So we did a survey, we asked people what people have been asked to do, and it's clear that the direct one-to-one interventions are continuing at a higher rate, additional literacy support's being provided, additional tutoring, additional work on play to support emotional well-being, and just a few of the small examples that we've seen. And what we've been trying to do is trying to quantify this and code this and make sure that people don't get exploited through this process. Because what we know is schools under pressure, under budget, we've seen teaching assistants being used exploited and overused, and we think that there needs to be a certain amount of measured use of teaching assistants throughout this process. So we've been discussing with the Education Endowment Foundation, which is an independent research organisation which looks at academic research. And after they did some research a few years ago, which initially gave a mixed picture of the outcome of TA interventions. And we pressed them to do more specific research. And since they've published a whole raft of research projects, which showed that well-maintained, well-trained, motivated and well-deployed teacher assistants have a significant impact on pupil outcomes, something which we've been pointing out at the highest levels for several years. As I said, there is a danger that schools will misuse this and not give teacher assistants the training they need, put them in front of classes when they're not prepared and not properly trained and not at the level they should be. But what we recognise is that there's a need for all staff to deserve more, better training and deployment. And I did earlier this week, I was invited to speak at the Times Education Commission, and I made a clear point of sticking up for support staff and the role that we play in schools, that you play in schools through this process. But it's also important that we get you the pay that you deserve. And before this sent to us, one of the questions, we're going to do some more with the questions. I was sent one following question, which said, having had the misfortune to see reporting from the Conservative Party conference this month, I was interested that many of the politicians present made the same remark, that now was the time to strive for better paid jobs and ask your employer for a rise. I think personally, my wages have dropped by around 20% in 20 years. And so that more or less means I work for free now. So when are we asking Nadine Zardawi and his friends to increase wages? Well, I think it was John who sent that in. I can assure you we are raising that with them all the time, and not just then, with the direct employers who pay that, which is the Local Government Association. And firstly, I would say to John that you need to be careful of your mental health to avoid checking on party political conferences, particularly the Tories. So you need to be very careful of doing some of that work. But what's clear is the pay for support staff in schools is woeful. We've been campaigning hard to get improvement. Last year we got a small above inflation rise, which is a start, but there's a long way to go. And we want to ensure that this year's offer is well above the current offer we've been offered by the employers of 1.75%, particularly as we've seen at what rate inflation is. So in a few weeks, you'll get your chance to have your say on pay when our industrial action ballot starts. It's absolutely vital that you fill that ballot paper in, because if you don't, then we can't take the sort of action we know will be necessary to make the employer pay more. And and there's no way of getting that additional money into your pockets when prices keep going this winter, unless you fill that ballot paper in. So I'm going to finish there, Chair, with a call to arms. A call on the government to put back in place the safety measures we need, a call on the anti-vaxxers to back off, and a call on you members to fill the ballot paper in and stand up for a decent pay rise. So thanks, and I look forward to some of the other questions I'm going to get later.
Thank you, John. That was great. I'll just pick up on one question that's already come into the chat, and it's a question around what we intend to do about the NJC pay claim and getting the message out. How are we going to prepare our school members for the industrial action ballot? And that was from James Robinson. And I think you've touched on it there. In the next few weeks, those ballot papers will be out. I know we've got a regional meeting on Thursday this week, so that preparation is starting to build now, and I think we need more of a detailed discussion specifically on that pay when we get to our regional service group meeting on Thursday. And I'll certainly be picking up that point that James has made. I'm sure James will be there as well to pick up that point, but we need to rally our members for that. Now we're in dispute over the pay. So I'm going to move on now to Chris Fabi, and Chris is going to do a presentation on us regarding ventilation. There's a couple of ventilation questions in the chat, Chris, if you're able to pick them up. If not, we'll bring the people in at the end to pick those up. Thanks. It's over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Pam. I'll just set the presentation up. Just can everyone see that? Is it showing? Thank you. Brilliant. Thanks, Pam. So, as Pam said, the presentation, and there's only about 8 or 9 slides, I'll try and be as brief as possible, is just to stress the work that Unison's doing on trying to get improvements in ventilation in schools as part of the COVID response. And I think it's just worth briefly starting off. I know we all know this, but I think it really underlies why ventilation is so important. It's the three main transmission routes, the risks of how you get COVID. Now, in the early days of the pandemic, this government, but also other governments, and indeed the World Health Organization, stressed very much the first two, which was the risk from contaminated surfaces. So someone who has COVID coughs or sneezes, and you touch the surface and you get viral particles on your hands, and then you touch your face. They also stress the risk from droplets, and they come from when somebody who's got COVID coughs or sneezes. They're larger particles, and this was the whole reason behind the rule of the 1.5 to 2 meter social distancing, because those particles, those droplets, tend to travel for about 1.5 to 2 meters. So if you're stood within that sort of distance, you could become infected. But increasingly, the third route, airborne transmission, has become accepted as being a route that is very high risk for transmission, for picking up COVID. And how that works, and forgive my non-scientific background, as my understanding it is, if an infected person can, when they breathe or talk, they can release very tiny particles called aerosols. And if they've got the virus can attach itself to those aerosols. And those aerosols, those particles, can remain suspended in the air for quite a long period of time. And it's particularly a risk in indoor settings where you've got lots of people, lots of talking, and where ventilation isn't great. So straight away, you can see the risk factor there for airborne transmission risks in schools. And Unison's been calling for a plan from government for many months. We just don't think they acted quick enough. In fact, we still don't believe they're acting quick enough on ventilation. So how do you reduce the risk of airborne transmission in schools, or indeed any workplace? And the first thing to do is to improve ventilation. And it is very basic. The reason why that's important is you bring in, when you ventilate, fresh air. You take out or break up the stale air, which contains the virus particles. So you either remove or dilute the virus, so you make the room safer by doing that. And how do you ventilate? Well, you can do that either through fresh air, so opening windows, opening doors in particular, air vents, getting a nice flow of clean, fresh air coming through. Now, the problem with that is we know twofold. One, as you go into winter, it becomes increasingly harder. You know, it's still important people keep the windows open, but the temptation is for people to close the windows. And secondly, we know some schools, because of the government funding cuts, the state of repair in some schools is not great. Some schools aren't able to open all windows in their classrooms. And one of the things Unison called for was that the government should use the summer to make sure there was a rolling programme of maintenance, extra funding put out into schools to make sure all classrooms could have windows that could open. And that was done in New York, but this government did nothing right up until the end of August on ventilation. It sat on its hands. So alongside ventilate fresh air, or instead of fresh air, and I think this is probably more of an issue in modern builds and potentially PFI schools, Keith was saying earlier, where you've got air conditioning. But the thing about air conditioning, you need to make sure that it isn't just recycling stale air, because if you're taking air from one room, moving it into the other where the virus was in one room, you risk spreading it. So what needs to happen is the air conditioning unit, as I understand it, needs to be switched to maximum inflow of outside air, of fresh air. So fresh air and or mechanical air through air conditioning, but that must be bringing in new air, not recycling old air. The other way of improving ventilation in a building is filtration. And there are devices out there which do what they say. They filter the air, and what they do is they essentially reduce, they take out of the air viral particles, and attached to those viral particles could be COVID virus if you've got somebody within the room who's exhaling, breathing out viral particles. Again, you can filter the air in two ways. Mechanically, you can have air conditioning units have specific filters fitted to it, but this is a very skilled piece of work, and your school would need to bring in a heating and air conditioning engineer to do this. But the other way, and this is increasingly where other countries are looking at, is you put in portable air filters into classrooms. Usually you need 2 of these, I understand. And fitted to those air filters, and they just plug in, are a thing called high efficiency particulate air filters, or HEPA filters, you may have heard them referred to. And there's growing evidence out there that they're very good at filtering out potentially viruses in crowded indoor spaces, particularly smaller spaces. One study I heard of yesterday found that if you have a room, so let's say a classroom where most people are wearing face coverings, and you have HEPA filters in the room, you reduce by 30-fold the number of airborne particles in that room. So that's a big impact you could have on reducing the risk of COVID transmission in that school. Again, as with air conditioning units, if you're using air filters, then they need to be regularly serviced and checked. Now, the German government has spent £500 million on improving ventilation, I understand, including HEPA filters in public buildings. All we've had from this government so far was, as Pam said earlier, the commitment in late August to roll out the CO2 monitors, which we welcomed at the time, but we've been calling for many months, but most schools still don't have them. And a very limited pilot, which I believe is being done by the Department of Health on HEPA filters in a number of schools in Bradford. They don't need a pilot. Other governments are starting to roll these things out. And when you've got infection rates of 1 in 14, you look what other countries are doing well, and then you act. So the other thing we need to do is, and I think this is important, something that can be done straight away, is to monitor how good the ventilation is in every school. And when we do that, we therefore can ascertain the level of risk of airborne transmission. And we monitor by proxy, we monitor the state of ventilation by monitoring how much exhaled air there is in a room. So how much carbon dioxide there is in a room. And we use carbon dioxide monitors. So these are very cheap. I think you can get them for about 30, 50 quid. The government has committed, did start a rollout very late. It's far too slow, as I said, to get these monitors into school. I think it's 1 for every 2 classrooms. And we've been calling these for months. And what they do is they monitor the carbon dioxide in the air. And they monitor it using a measurement, I understand, called parts per million, so ppm. Now, what I'd like to say is, we don't want schools to wait on the DFE to act, because the last thing you should do is wait on this government. So schools can be looking at their ventilation, and should be looking at their ventilation now, looking at rooms that haven't got natural ventilation, can't open windows, getting their air conditioning if they're a PFI school or a modern school, modern new build school, checked. So there are rooms that feel particularly stuffy. That's always an indicator, apparently, of poor ventilation. And we'd also encourage schools, while they're waiting on the DFE, to get a couple of monitors. They only need a couple for the school while they're waiting. They're 30 quid each. They can bill the DFE if they want, but get those monitors in and start checking the state of the ventilation now while you're waiting for those monitors to come through. So the central question is what's a safe level and what's an unsafe level of carbon dioxide in a room? So what's an unsafe level of what's an unsafe level of ventilation, essentially? Now, we look to the Health and Safety Executive, the body that is responsible for regulating health and safety legislation and implementing, making sure health and safety legislation is implemented correctly in this country. And we also look to the government's own scientists, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, SAGE. And they've both said, along with a lot of other countries around the world, that when you monitor in a room using a CO2 monitor, you want to keep the level of carbon dioxide below 800 parts per million. So what they say is you want to start taking action, i.e. improving ventilation, opening up doors if you haven't got the doors open, cranking up the aircon, bringing HEPA filters, etc. If you can't bring in natural air, once you get above 700, you want to try and keep it below 800 parts per million. Now, the concern we have is the Department for Education has issued guidance, which they've sent out to schools in advance of many of them receiving their monitors, which we're concerned about. We think it's confusing. We think also, we believe the levels it set out are unsafe. They're not safe. Because what they say in their guidance, put it in a quote there, is firstly, they say a consistent value, so reading on the COT monitor over 800 should be 800 ppm should be an early indicator to increase ventilation. SAGE and the HSE have said you should keep it below 800, not an early indicator. But more worryingly, it goes on to say that you should take action to improve ventilation where the readings are higher than 1500. That's a very high reading. Schools, that actually puts schools in a very difficult position, because we would argue that's an unsafe level of ventilation. And the responsibility will then rest with the school. If you look at, say, what other countries are doing, 800, 700. So Unison, and I'll go into more detail on it, rejects that advice and guidance and has challenged the government on that. And I'll tell you what we're doing to assist schools. But the most worrying part of that guidance is it states, even if it goes over 1500 parts per million, that you can still use the room. Now that raises a question, then what is the point? What is the point of CO2 monitoring? We say you're going to monitor, but you don't need to do anything about it. We completely disagree with that, and we're challenging the government, and we're also acting to work with schools to support them. So our position is that your school should follow Health and Safety Executive and the government's own scientific advisors' advice, SAGE advice. And the measure they should adopt is to look to try and keep CO2 levels in classrooms and in the rest of the school, in other rooms, below 800 parts per million. If a room goes over 1500, then we're clear it should be temporarily vacated, and that additional measures should then be brought in that room to get the levels down to a safe level. We don't accept that that room should continue to be used. What we take, because all you will do is you'll increase the risk of transmission of people getting ill, if it's spreading across the school, and people losing more education and having a higher staff absences. So what's Unison doing? We've written to the government. We actually asked them for a copy of the guidance in advance, because we were concerned there were rumours that we're going to set the level really high. So we've written to the government. And interestingly, in response about what constitutes a safe level, at one of the meetings, the government said to us, well, ultimately it's up to the schools because the responsibility lies with the schools, which is really unhelpful to the schools, particularly if you're going to give contradictory advice and we think unsafe advice. So the joint unions have issued our own joint union ventilation guidance. It's got a whole range of measures recommended in there that schools can take to improve their ventilation, get carbon dioxide levels down. I sent a copy to Keith and Pam earlier. It's been sent to every school, but we want to reinforce the message. And we're calling on the schools not to wait on the government, calling on them to do their audits now on ventilation, get in a couple of monitors if need be. And then to a central question, what can you do? I would urge you really to do a couple of things. One, make sure your union's got your school has got a copy of the joint union ventilation guidance. Share it with other staff in the school as well. Also request a copy of the school's risk assessment. They legally have to do a risk assessment. And as part of that, there must be measures in there to identify and reduce the risks from airborne transmission. And that would be an audit of ventilation. So request a copy of that risk assessment. Now, finally, if you're concerned about ventilation in your school, say, for instance, the school is using rooms which you believe have got unsafe levels of ventilation, so say over 1500, then please make immediate contact with your branch. This is a really important point, because we've got in place, Unison branches have in place procedures for raising and challenging employers on unsafe levels of, on breaches of health and safety and on unsafe levels of ventilation. So if you have issues in your school about unsafe ventilation, immediately contact your branch. And finally, just to say, ventilation is really important, but it's not on its own the answer. All the way through the pandemic, I think as John said earlier about lessons learned, one of the big lessons learned is about multi-layered approach. We need good ventilation, we need masks, we need social distancing, we need good hygiene, because all together they will increase the chance of being able to actually reduce the risks of COVID. And the reason why we want to do it is because we don't want another winter like we had last winter. And actually what we're doing is we're saying put in place measures now to stop the illness and stop the disruption to education. Ventilation is a key part of that, but it's one part of that, but it's an important part of that. Thanks, Pam. Pam, sorry that I can't see the chat. Was there a couple of questions? You want to read them out and I can take them?
Yeah, will do, Chris. Yeah, there was one question from a lady called Dawn Middleton, and it was, I'll give you both questions at once and then you can come back on both. One was, our school building is only 5 years old and it is one of the new breathable buildings. Do we still need the CO2 detectors installing? And then the second question on ventilation from Hayley Wilson, what is the point of installing CO2 monitoring equipment if nothing is done about the high levels? What are useless action if we don't do anything about it? Well, I think your presentation is very clear. You can do something about it. But if you want to pick those 2 points up, thanks, Chris.
Yeah, so I have to admit, I don't know what a breathable building is, so I'll have to Google it. But one thing I would say is the department have committed to getting CO2 monitors to every school. I think whatever school you're in, you want to monitor the level of CO2 in those classrooms. And just to stress, it isn't just about COVID. It's shown that rooms that have high levels of CO2 also an impairment to learning, you know, headaches, fuzzy headaches. We're going into the flu season. So without knowing exactly what a breathable school is, I still think you would want CO2 monitoring in the school. And then secondly, you're right, Pam, we're challenging the government's level of 1,500. We've got our guidance that's going to schools, so we can do something about it, and we will do something about it. And we anticipate most schools, vast majority of schools, will do the right thing because they're being let down by government, and we want to work with them jointly to make schools safer. So there is every point in monitoring it because we can challenge it if there's unsafe practices.
Okay, thanks, Chris. We've had a question from Rena Wood asking, can your presentation be shared? So if you could share that with, Keith can share it with people across the region. That's not a problem. I think we've covered most of the questions there on the ventilation. There was just one point about schools not having the funds to pay for things. I mean, that is an issue, and we're certainly not saying that schools should pay for these things. The money should be there funded by central government, but if it's a health and safety risk, there is an obligation on the school to put things right. So wherever there's a concern, it should be challenged and people need to flag things up with the local branch. Okay, thanks, Chris, for that. What I'm going to do now is just move on to just make a few points about school funding, and then if people still want to put some questions in the chat, we can pick some more questions up. And we've got some questions that have already been sent in. So I just want to make a few points on school funding, because as far as school budgets go, it's very clear the government is failing children, especially those with special educational needs and disabilities. So without that adequate high needs funding, thousands of children are losing out on a proper education and the support they need to learn. And along with the shortfall in the special educational needs funding, schools are facing huge increased costs for energy and utility charges and the expense of school meals, etc. Everything seems to be rising, so there's great pressure on schools' budgets. So the budget, the government budget earlier this year has been described as a missed opportunity for education, and it's failed to provide additional cash for schools. The budget focused on measures to help the country recover economically from the pandemic. And it's by extending the furlough scheme until September, raising initiatives to hire apprentices, etc. Measures like that, but there was no extra funding for schools beyond existing planned budget increases and catch-up schemes, those catch-up schemes had already been announced by the government, and even the money for the catch-up is nowhere near as much as it's required to do that catch-up effectively. The government have ignored their own research into what is needed. So heads are reporting that they've already had to sacrifice funding for teaching assistants, special needs support, cancelling school trips, etc. And that's to stay out of the red. And that's according to polling conducted by the National Association of Ed Teachers. So the research that they did found that nearly a third of all school leaders had made cuts to balance the budgets in the past academic year. and the situation appears to be getting worse, with more than 1 in 4 school leaders predicting a deficit in this current academic year. So that's up from to nearly 1 in 5 schools facing severe budget pressures. And also, because of the pandemic, schools are reporting average additional costs such as enhanced cleaning and safety measures of around, the average is around £24,500, and there's additional supply teacher costs. Average cost is coming out at around £13,700, and average lost income as well for those schools that rent out the school facilities. They're reporting losses that average nearly £22,000 a year, and that's all due to the pandemic, and it's money that cannot be replaced. So that's adding even more pressure onto schools' budgets. So you only have to read the research to see that many schools are in a dire situation regarding their budgets. And our major concern with this, on top of the concerns of children not being provided with the support they need for their education, is that many schools will need to make cuts to staffing to save substantial amounts of money. And we know that support staff are normally the first target in such cuts. So the Unison branch officials, we will of course be supporting our members with any consultation processes that are commenced in schools, and many of these processes we fear will lead to redundancies. So nationally, we will continue to make the case for improved funding for schools, and we will dig deep into school finances when cuts are proposed. But we fear that the cuts are coming, possibly in the new year is when many of us are saying that we feel that schools will start the restructuring processes. And many of the schools held off last academic year. We haven't seen as much restructuring as we did the year previous. And that's because schools were working so hard to keep schools open during the pandemic that they just couldn't afford to cut the staff. Otherwise, the schools would have closed. It was the school support staff who ensured that schools could remain open. So if your school proposes any changes, you must ensure that you contact your branch for support, and also encourage your colleagues to join Unison, as we can support them also. And also, as a team of staff facing severe cuts and redundancies, you will be stronger together. So it's just a few points from me on the pressures on school budgets, down to the pandemic and down to the fact that schools are not properly funded regardless of any pandemic, and the pressure that that's going to have going forward. We do fear that we will see lots of cuts within schools. Okay, so what I wanted to do was just to open it up to a few more questions. If there's none in the chat, I'll just have a look if there's any more in the chat. Please bear with me. So somebody sent in an anonymous question. It says, my concern is that when a school has rates of COVID rates are high and reporting to public health, that we're still not reduced mixing. They're not allowed to refer to bubbles anymore. That's a new phrase on me, reduced mixing. But would anybody like to respond to that? John, possibly, about the fact that there's no bubbles in school anymore and cases are high within schools? Thanks.
Yeah, sure, happy to do so, Pat. I mean, absolutely, and we've been crystal clear with the government that this is a failure, an absolute failure, and will lead to increase, and has led to increases. They are adamant that they are taking this off, and that because, and to an extent, that there is something in this that children don't get quite so ill, and that with double vaccination, illness is not so good. But it's still taking people out of school. It's still making people still ill, and some people will get seriously ill as a result of this. So, we think it's completely wrong with the government. You can see in the past few days that the new Secretary of State has started to wobble. He started talking about the possibility of reintroducing things. And we've seen councils begin to move and do it locally. So councils are taking the leadership in this and going ahead and reintroducing bubbles and measures. So for us, we've got to keep that pressure on. We've got to keep raising it with our schools, with our politicians, with our councillors, and just keep saying, if we're to stop this and get us back to where we are, we need to take a step back, and we need to reintroduce bubbles. We need to reintroduce some of the face coverings we've been doing.
Okay, thank you, John. Questions that we had previously sent in, I'm just going to put them to some of our speakers today. First one, I think Chris, you'd be able to answer this question for us. It's in relation to question is, how do unvaccinated staff stand with the isolation period if they've got no symptoms? Can they still attend work? So that's round unvaccinated and no symptoms.
So I presume you mean if you've tested positive, and that's how. I mean,
yeah, I think
yeah,
that's what the
or
question.
you're a contact. You've
very
tested
clear.
positive.
Yeah,
yeah, you've
Yeah.
tested positive or you're close contact. You have to isolate, and you should if you're unvaccinated. I mean, that's, you know, I don't know your individual circumstances, but you know that'd be one of the great advantages as well of getting vaccinated. So yeah, you will have to vaccinate. You will have to self-isolate. I don't know your individual case, and you should self-isolate in those circumstances.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And a further question around a positive test. It's this is a big question of concern. This person's asking, why are support staff not informed if they have worked with a child who has tested positive? And that's from a teaching assistant. Chris, are you able to comment on that at all?
Yeah, so we've done and we sent this out to schools in late August, where we were very clear that the measures were not going to be enough to stop a spike in cases. And one of the things we've said is that schools, when they have a positive case, without identifying the individual, but sometimes that's unavoidable in that scenario, but the affected people should be told so that they can take necessary measures, because you're at greater risk if you're working one-to-one with someone. You may live with someone who's clinically vulnerable. We think you have a right to know. And interestingly, a number of local authorities are bringing back contact tracing within schools. We were opposed to the removal of contact tracing. We think it should have been kept within schools. So what I would do in terms of practical advice is have a look on the Unison Schools COVID page. You'll find the risk assessment checklist in there. And in that checklist, it specifically says that staff should be made aware of positive cases in their school. And in light of the rising cases, make sure your school's got a copy of that, or ask your branch to contact them and ask for a response, ask them to commit to that measure.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Picking up a further question that was sent in.
Can I just come in on that?
Sorry,
I mean,
Keith.
no, it's all right. I mean, a number of multi-academy trusts and a number of local authorities are already taking that opportunity to inform staff and to inform parents on what has actually taken place with a child that's been tested positive on COVID. So we've got a mixed match in the Northwest at the present moment. But as Chris says, the more pressure we put on local authorities and multi-academy trusts, they are now starting to develop that and go back to what we had in July. So there is some positive that's actually coming out of the pressure that we're putting on at the present moment.
Okay, thanks, Keith. And then let me see, just bear with me 1 second, just trying to keep track of the chat and the questions that we've had. A question I think I'd put to John, please, and this is around as a teaching assistant. I'll read the question out in full for you, John. As a teaching assistant, we've gone into school throughout lockdown, even had to go and work in breakfast club. Now we're asked to take classes of 10 to 15 children for various things, i.e. phonics. Sometimes the teacher only takes 8 children. Some teaching assistants are not even qualified to take the class. This has gone on for years and there does not seem to be any clear guidelines as to what a teaching assistant's duties are. I'm sure Keith would like to come in as well, but I'll put it to John first, please.
Always remember to take off mute. That's the first thing. Okay, so thanks. There's some really interesting stuff in there. So what we know is that the pandemic has sort of sort of, blown things up in a sense. And I think what we need to be clear at is we need to get back. It's one of the things I've been doing some work with my colleague Joe, who leads for us on teaching assistants, is about trying to get back to a situation where there's logic within the system. And there's actually been some interesting research which sorts of turns some of the logic and things around. What we need to do is we need to get to a situation where there's new work coming on, there's new research, but that means that people aren't exploited. So, for instance, historically, what you would tend to have is you would tend to have, and this is the research from the Education Endowment Foundation. I'll put this in the chat in a minute. And what that is historically, what's tended to happen is that teachers have done the general class and then have sent teaching assistants out in one-to-one classes and working direct or done some general work, small group works. But what happened is those people, as has been said there, people aren't trained that, TAs aren't trained to do that. They're not given the proper support. It's sometimes dumped on them. So what happens is in with that situation, it means that the pupils will not benefit. How can they when they're being, when everyone's getting a raw deal out of this? So what the research has shown in places is that actually, if you get well planned, well organised, specific programs, things like REACH or the Nuffield early learning REACH, switch on reading, catch up numeracy, catch up abracadabra. So a series of programs like that. That if you use those and teaching assistants run those programs well within qualified, taught and trained and work through that process, and then so in larger classes, and the teachers go out and then do some high quality, detailed, specific work on those who are dropping behind, then that's a really useful way of using teaching assistants. However, they need to be the right qualified, they need to be the right level, they need to be properly qualified, they need to be trained. And that's the problem we have, is that schools are trying to do this on the cheap. They're not using the right level TAs, they're not using the right qualifications, and that means that they're exploiting teaching assistants through the process. So that's one of the things we want to tackle. It's one of the things we've been hammering the department now for the past few months since we started to come out of lockdown about that exploitation. The department does not want to instruct schools on this. It does not want to tell schools how to do things, because clearly they know how much pressure schools are under. There is some support in this. It's not quite right that there aren't any duties are. We tried to do some work a few years ago about making it a lot stronger, but there's things called the role profiles, the NJC role profiles, and they give you some sorts of levels of what you would expect teaching assistants to do at those certain levels. So what I'll do is I'll put both those bits of information I've talked up about, the role profiles, which show you the sorts of things that different level TAs should be, and you would expect TAs to be paid different amounts for that, and then the Education Endowment Foundation, which shows you some of the work and some of the specific programs which actually are very useful and shows that TAs can have some direct pupil work. So I'll do that now, Pam. Yep.
Okay, thanks, John. I'm just going to bring Keith into if he wants to add some points to that, but also to throw in another question that's come in, Keith, that you can build into your response. It's from a lady called Helen Norm. No, it's not. It's an anonymous question. They're saying that they teach a phonics group of 14 for an hour each day, and as I'm teaching, she's training herself basically as she's teaching them, and they also do an afternoon of PPA each week at a level 2 TA. So Keith, would you like to respond to that, please?
Rather than going into a rant that I normally do, I mean, it comes down to the simple fact is support staff, and I include lab technicians on this because lab technicians and TAs are being used as teachers on the cheap. And we've been saying, and we've been working on this for quite considerable time now, by saying to members, for goodness sake, try and work within the parameters of your role, your job description, and work with your branch. It does, and it has been a real problem in schools. It's very hard to say no, and it's very hard to actually turn around to the senior leadership team that you can't do it, shouldn't be doing it, and it's not in your job description, and you're not getting paid enough for it. And we're trying to get the message out there as much as we possibly can to say to support staff, for goodness sake, work with us. We know that there are problems in schools. We want to try and help the schools as much as we possibly can. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we're not there to, to take over and take leadership of a class. Our role in this support, to develop the children and to work with the children on a one-to-one basis and to help them through. It is not to actually say, oh, well, the teacher's not in because they're sick and everything else. All schools have insurance. All schools have policies where they should have cover available for them. And if the cover is long-term, then schools should put into place some measures in that and shouldn't rely on the support staff. And I think, we're trying to get that message out as much as possibly can. It has been difficult in the last 2 months where we've seen an increase on the numbers of support staff undertaking the role. And I would say to any member out there tonight, if that is a problem in your workplace, work with your branch, talk to your branch. Your branch will have the necessary arguments and sort of like expertise to actually work with that. And if you're working in a multi-academy trust, which is quite a large multi-academy trust, and there is a problem, then your branch will know who's the main negotiator in that. It may be myself, it may be Pam, it may be Kath Bagley, it may be one of the officers from the branches. They will be able to have an input to that multi-academy trust to say there's a problem, and Unison shouldn't be picking up everybody else's issues, and the support staff shouldn't be picking up those issues just to undertake the role and responsibility of a teacher. So there is a lot we can actually do on this, and it's just working collectively on it and working where we can develop the knowledge and the skills for our members to turn this round and work with the teachers and work with the senior leadership team. Unfortunately, not all the time the senior leadership team want to work with us, but we will actually so I have an input to them directly to say enough's enough on this, and we shouldn't be expecting support staff to undertake roles which far outweigh their pay. And we've already seen that the pay at the present moment is chronic, and our pay offer is chronic as well. And I think that's why we want to try and get that message across as much as possibly can.
Thanks, Keith. There's just a further point been brought into it that I think you've covered, but just to make this point, this Hayley Wilson is saying that all the TAs are level 3 but only paid at level 2, and they make sure that we're level 3 so that we can cover classes on the cheap. No, the key there is you are paid and employed as a level 2 TA, so you should only be doing level 2 duties. So you need to put that point across at school, and if you need some support with it, you need to contact your branch. Just because you're qualified at something doesn't mean to say you have to do it if you're not being paid appropriately. So, right, I'm just going to skip back to another question that we've had, and this was in relation to consultation on compulsory redundancies, and it was from James Robinson. I'm not sure who on the panel would want to pick this one up or can respond to this one. It's quite a complex question, really, even though it's only short. It's saying, if we're faced with compulsory redundancies, can we have support in the ballot process, in particular about timescales? As due to consultation periods, it can be difficult to meet the ballot timescales before cuts are made. Is there anybody that would want to come in on that point? As it's regional, Keith, would you? Anybody? It is really difficult.
I think it's one for John, really. I mean,
yeah. Okay.
The problems we have is the government laws. The government have statutory timetables, which we now have to do. It's deliberately introduced by the government to try and stop industrial action. And so there are certain things that we have to do. We have to go through a cleansing process to ensure the records are right, because if we either ballot someone who shouldn't be balloted or don't ballot someone who shouldn't be balloted, then we can be fined. We then have to give certain periods of notification with the employers. We then have to go through the balloting process. We have to give a certain time. We're only allowed to send paper ballots. We're not allowed to do digital balloting, even though everyone else has jumped into the 21st century. And then we have to give a certain amount of time afterwards. So we would love to go through and move things along and speed ballots up. But unfortunately, we are hamstrung by the law. So I can assure you, when I go into ballots, and we're going through 2 or 3 very large ones at the moment nationally, and it is easier to do it locally. You can speed things up a little locally where we can, and I know colleagues, particularly in your region, are very keen to keep the ballot as tight as possible. But you cannot do a ballot under a certain number of weeks, because that just makes it very difficult. And of course, employers know that. So of course they're going to run consultations to try and make it difficult for us. But Keith's put his hand up, Pam, so maybe he will save me before I get rabid.
Okay,
No,
thanks, John.
I mean, just to say that we have had some successful ballots in the Northwest just recently, and I think, you know, each case is on its merits, and we would encourage and we would work with the branches, and I certainly would work with the branches to try and help as much as we possibly can to work on this, because as I said, we want to turn it around as quickly as we possibly can. And I think, you know, we are getting into a chronic situation come January, and that is a real worry. Easter far more, because January we get the notification. Not all schools, you know, work with us on that, but you know, governors get that information. The governors, you know, the minutes from the governors' meetings are available to all staff. It's a problem in the academies, but once you get notification, once you get wind of any problems, please contact the branch. Then we can actually work on that as quickly as possible.
Okay, thanks, Keith. I've just got one more question here that's probably, it is specific for you, I think, Keith. It's regarding Wigan Council, that staff have been asked to sign and return principal acceptance return form by the, just hold on, my messages are jumping around everywhere, by the 15th of October regarding term time salary calculation, and is Unison in the process of negotiating this with the council? Thanks, Keith.
I think the Wigan situation on term, I think it might be term time only, is one that's been covered by the branch and the region, and that is, it's something which we are advising the members, and there's letters been going out about that. And I'm going to be very careful in what I say about the Wigan Council offer. It's not acceptable. It's nowhere near. And I think, you know, we've already just on the verge, well, not on the verge, we're signed up. And we're going to be talking to members on a 5-year deal, 5 years and 3 months for members who work in LDST, which is an academy trust, a Church of England Academy Trust, covering, ironically, some schools in Wigan, Sefton, and also St Helens. So ironically, we are got a deal where it's 5 years and 3 months on term time only. What Wigan Council are doing is shortchanging the staff. And I think you were asking the Wigan members to work closely with us on that. And I think the members should have had a letter from their branch explaining what the situation is. I know that the branch and the regional organiser for Wigan have been working closely on this, and they've put letters to the council saying that, you know, the offer is not acceptable, the offer is derisory, and especially when now just down the road or even across the road from your school, there is a multi-academy trust who's given us the opportunity to say to our members and recommend to our members 5 years and 3 months.
Okay, thanks, Keith. I'm just going to bring in Paddy Cleary. You've got your hand up, Paddy. Did you want to come in and ask a question? Thanks.
Only on that, Pam, thanks. Working alongside Keith in relation to as the RO for Wigan, and I sent an email to Vicky Lowe last week in relation to an improved offer. There's a meeting this week with the solicitors nationally and also with Thompson's, and Keith's aware of that, so just wants to come in to back him up on that, really, Pam.
Okay, thanks, Paddy. Right, we've very fast got to just quite approaching 7 o'clock, which is where we said we would end the meeting. So unfortunately, I can't pick up any more questions that we've had sent in, but there does seem to be a common theme with some of the questions, and that's around TAs working above the level that they are paid for. And I can only urge you to speak to your local branch with your specific concerns around that, and we will be able to offer some support. So please do contact your branch. It's just for me now to conclude the meeting, and just Keith's waving at me. He's always got to get the last word, hasn't he?
One thing, Pam, is that we need more contacts, more stewards in schools. That is crucial. The more information we're getting helps the region and the branches deal with what is actually happening on the ground at the present moment, and it's been really helpful in the last year having the more contacts and more stewards.
And also, don't forget the NJC pay ballot.
There's Rena with the NJC pay ballot, yeah, which we're going to discuss in detail on Thursday at our service group meeting, and then we'll get information out to schools, because schools will be key. School members will be key in getting that ballot over the line, because, you know, the government knows if school members decide to partake in that ballot, we will win that ballot, and we will hopefully get the government to move on that paltry offer that they've made. So again, all I can do is urge you to contact your branch if you've got any concerns regarding duties of what level you paid at, any COVID issues. Your branches have got all the resources, the expertise. If they've not, we've got people in place that can support. So just shout out if you've got any concerns. And I just want to thank tonight Keith, Chris and John, and Connor McCurran, who's in the background, who does all our organising. He's kept us sane again this afternoon. So thanks very much for everybody for attending, and have a good evening. And again, shout out if you need any support. Thanks. Take care. Goodbye.
Thanks, Pam. Well